The Iraqi armed forces are the military forces of the Republic of Iraq. Iraq armed forces consist of the army, the air force, and the navy. The armed forces of Iraq have a long and very active history. They were initially formed in the early 1920s. 6 military coups d'états were mounted by the army between 1936 and 1941. The armed forces first saw combat in the Anglo-Iraqi War of 1941. They fought against Israel in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, in the 1967 Six-Day War, and in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. 2 wars with the Kurds were fought from 1961 to 1970 and in 1974 and 1975. A much larger conflict was the Iran-Iraq War, initiated by the Iraqis in 1980, which continued until 1988. Thereafter Iraq began the invasion of Kuwait, which led to the Persian Gulf War of 1991, which led in turn to confrontations over the Iraqi no-fly zones during the 1990s. And finally the Iraq War of 2003. 2 strong categories for Iraq have been logistics and combat engineering. Iraqi soldiers have also usually fought hard in difficult situations. The armed forces are administered by the Ministry of Defense. Since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which toppled the Saddam Hussein regime, the Iraqi armed forces have been rebuilt with substantial assistance from the United States Armed Forces. Since the implementation of the U.S.-Iraq Status of Forces Agreement on January 1, 2009, the Iraqi armed forces and the forces of the Iraqi Interior Ministry are responsible for providing security and upholding law and order throughout Iraq. The Iraqi army, in particular, is one of the most trusted national institutions of Iraq. The Iraqi armed forces' deficiencies have been identified in enabling functions, such as, e.g., logistics and military intelligence. In high-end conventional operations, Iraqi capabilities are currently limited by lack of artillery and air power. Article 9 of the Constitution of Iraq establishes the legal basis of the Iraqi armed forces. Much of the wording of Article 9 draws upon Article 27 of the 2004 Transitional Administrative Law. Part A. First section. Article 9 states that the Iraqi armed forces and security services will be composed of the components of the Iraqi people with due consideration given to their balance and representation. Without discrimination or exclusion, they shall be subject to the control of the civilian authority, shall defend Iraq, shall not be used as an instrument to oppress the Iraqi people, shall not interfere in political affairs, and shall have no role in the transfer of authority. Parts B and C prohibit the formation of military militias outside the framework of the armed forces and prohibit armed forces personnel from standing for political office or campaigning for political candidates. Part C expressively notes that military personnel are allowed to vote in elections. Part A expressively states the Iraqi government's commitment to the respect and implementation of Iraq's international obligations regarding the non-proliferation, non-development, non-production, and non-use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The second section says that military service shall be regulated by law. Iraq's legislation on defense dates from the Coalition Provisional Authority period of 2003-2004. CPA Order 22 established the new Iraqi Army on August 18, 2003, and CPA Order 67 renamed the new Iraqi Army the Iraqi Armed Forces on March 21, 2004. In the process, the new Iraqi Army was expanded to include an army, air force, coastal defense force, reserve forces, and other elements. Iraq does not appear to have publicly issued a National Defense Review or White Paper. Much of defense policy since 2003 has been set by the United States. For example, one mission objective for multinational force Iraq was an Iraq that has a security force that can maintain domestic order and deny Iraq as a safe haven for terrorists. To do this, the U.S. aimed to train and equip Iraq's security forces and gradually transition security responsibilities to them. In 2010 there are at least 3 major defense tasks. They are the suppression of the insurgency, the resolution of the Kurdish Peshmerga forces status in relation to the Iraqi armed forces, themselves, and longer term, the growth of the armed forces so that they can defend Iraq from external threats. The armed forces of Iraq as a modern country began to be formed by the British after they assumed mandated control over Iraq after 1917. During the March 1921 Cairo Conference, it was agreed that an Iraqi army would be created along British lines, with training and equipment provided by the UK. King Faisal wanted an army of 15,000 to 20,000 men. The army actually grew from 3,500 in 1922 to 7,000 in 1927 and then to 11,500 in 1932. The army became a modernizing influence in the country. In 1931, the Iraqi Air Force was founded with a small number of pilots. 6 army coups took place, with one in 1936 being led by Bakr Siddiqui and the last being the Rashid Ali coup of 1941. Fall.